All right, welcome to the last group of mini lectures for Discover Geography. And in this group, we're going to be talking about human-environment interactions, kind of the last theme in geography. What I want you to focus on in each of these lectures are both the definitions and an example of their application. So let's get started. Over the next series of lectures, what we're going to be talking about are some environmental concepts. Then we'll move into how we understand change. We'll talk a little bit about humans in the environment. Then we're going to talk about an idea called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin. And lastly, we'll do a group of very short lectures on humans and what we call the IPAT equation. All right, so key terms. And again, I know there's a lot of material on this slide, but I need you to get this down, and then I'm going to give you the examples. So quite simply, environment. Whenever we use that term, sometimes you hear the natural environment versus the human environment. And that's really kind of a false way of talking about it. Environment simply means all of the external conditions or factors affecting an organism. So you exist right now in an environment. It has a temperature, might have humidity, a certain level of light, there are things in the room that you're in, there might be other animals or there might not be. But that is the environment. It's quite simply all of those things that affect you. Okay, so now let's break that down. Within an environment, then, we can also talk about an ecosystem. And when we talk about an ecosystem, what we mean is this is the community of living organisms that interact and their environment. So in environment, we simply said it's everything around you. But then if we say an ecosystem, what we mean in this case is that there are different organisms that interact. Right now, my ecosystem is in fact the room that I'm in, plus my cat, and it might be some small follicle mites that are on my skin. It is the birds outside the window. It is all those things that interact in various ways. And again, the abiotic component, that means the non-living component. The light, the atmospheric temperature, humidity, the soil characteristics, all these things are things that we consider part of the ecosystem. Now we're going to take it a little bit farther down. Within an ecosystem, then, if we take and just look at the interacting organisms in a given time, we call it a community. So if you think about, again, a basic idea of a fish tank, all of the fish in the tank plus all of the aquatic plants and any of the little other critters, the microscopic critters that are in there, that is a community. Those are interacting in a given space, in a given time. That's the living things. We look at communities then oftentimes through the lens of biodiversity. And we want to be sure that biodiversity, oftentimes people simply say, well, how many different kinds of things there are. And that's important. That is one aspect of biodiversity. We often call that species diversity. But there is also the genetic diversity, that is the number of organisms of a given species and what their level of genetic diversity is. And so large populations typically are far more diverse than small populations. And then lastly, in terms of biodiversity, we also have the number of ecosystems that are interacting. Okay, the number of different types of ecosystems in an area. So we might say within a area, defined area, we can say a wetland area, or if you want to think about it in an urban setting, we might have the park areas, the tops of roof areas. We have, again, the cul-de-sacs, all sorts of little areas that have different characteristics to them. Okay, the very last definition is quite simply something that kind of sums all this up, and that is what we call the biosphere. And that is the totality of living aspects of our planet. So the biosphere is that sphere where life exists. And so obviously life does not exist in the hard rock depths of Earth, nor does it exist at the very outer reaches of our atmosphere. But within that, relatively shallow into the soil, and up to about 30,000 feet, we have some level of biotic activity, life activity. So we call it the biosphere. All right, so let's take a quick look at this, and I want you to make sure that you can see these different ways of looking at the world around you. It's easy to see this and say, well, this isn't a natural environment, but it is environment. In other words, this is simply a space, and you can see in it all the things that might be affecting a given tree. So we think of the environment in terms of, if I'm taking this picture, well, all of this around me is my environment at that moment. It has the temperature, the humidity, it has the shade from the trees. It might have, again, the trees are giving off oxygen. The building casts a shadow. All of those things influence me. And so that is my environment, natural or otherwise. We can also, though, look at this and say, well, okay, this is also actually an ecosystem, because, in fact, this is a grassed area where you have grasses interacting with trees, interacting with population of squirrels, and the runoff from the sidewalks, the shadow from the building, the heat and light from the sun. So the ecosystem is the community of organisms and populations interacting with the abiotic component. We can also then clearly see this is a community. Okay, again, community, we say these are interacting living things. And we could say the level of biodiversity here. Well, how many different kinds of trees do we see? How many of each tree are there? What is their diversity? And how many little ecosystems or microecosystems might you see here? And so, just because humans exist in a landscape and have altered it, doesn't mean it's not these things. If we look at it from overhead, one of the interesting things that we see is that sometimes from overhead we can see, oops, let me go back here, we can see some characteristics that we don't see on the ground. And so, for example, we can see that, in fact, there are slight differences in environments here. You notice where people walk here and they change the soil characteristics. Over here we have the same thing. We have shadows now. And so we can see different environments, and we can also think of these different patches as some levels of micro ecosystems. Again, we can look at what we often would think of as a natural environment. Again, this is an African termite mound. There is sunlight. All these things, if you take the individual standing here, or if I take this acacia tree, what is its environment? Okay, again, it is everything that surrounds it that's impacting its life. We can also say that this is clearly an ecosystem where acacia trees, other types of thorn scrubs, in this case termites, large massive termites, all interact with their abiotic or non-living components. We can also see this from above, and what's interesting is that organisms do the same thing time after time. Human beings changed their landscape. Well, these two termite mounds, and those things in the red circles are termite mounds, they do the same thing. They clear landscapes and fundamentally alter it. Okay, so all of these areas are different ways of seeing these interconnected terms. The environment that we see here for these corals or for these types of mangroves. This is red mangrove here. This is an ecosystem of water, the abiotic components and the biotic components. There are high levels of biodiversity here. There's several ecosystems, so ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and then genetic diversity here. So we see all of these things present. All right, that's it for this lecture. We'll move on to how we interpret human change in the environment.